Good afternoon. For the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to go through a day in the life of a HETAC panel member. I didn't put the word typical in because there's no such thing as a typical day or days, notwithstanding that the process is broadly the same. The photographs that follow were taken by a colleague of ours who was at a recent evaluation, and I see some of the suspects that are in the pictures actually are here around the table, so if they hadn't an opportunity to clean themselves up for this, they'll have to hold their head, I suppose, in shame. But in fact, actually, the photographs are superb. Now, why do I say it? There's not a typical day in the life. We've a range of reviews. We've institutional review, programme validation, Section 26 review, which would look at the withdrawal of a programme, and then we have panels for professional alignment. And while the broad structure of all of these same days is the same, the outcome can be different, the processes are slightly different, the criteria that we work with are different. But broadly, I'm going to bring you through the main points in the process. The day, in fact, begins for the panel members when the submission documents arrive. And the submission documents can vary from a small envelope with a couple of A4 folders in it to the big box. And recently I was at the receiving end of the big box where every panel member got the big box and wondered were they going to get some sort of allowance for physiotherapy afterwards, having had to bring a big box of books. The important thing with the submission documents is that they're read in advance, and invariably, irrespective of the volume of documentation we receive, once we read this documentation, we find that there are gaps in it, there's things we don't understand, we've lots of superfluous information. So the purpose in advance of any panel visit that you would be on, or panel involvement, is that you would read those documents. To date, it hasn't always been a requirement, but I think it will be more so going forward, the requirement that in the expert panel actually write something in advance, as in their preliminary observations about the documentation regarding the process that is to follow. What's your gut feel in advance? What have you read? What's missing? What questions aren't answered for you? What are the really innovative things that pop out at you? Where are they doing things that you haven't seen before? So I think it's important that you read the documents and that every panel member would read the documents in advance. Now, there's no point reading them weeks in advance. Experience has shown that people usually read them on the way to the day before, but the important thing is that you read them in advance and that you have formed some sort of an opinion before you meet with the panel. Travel to the location generally happens the evening before, and this is a very important aspect of the evaluation process. It's important on a number of levels. It's important, as a colleague of mine said yesterday, that the HETAC panel hunts like a pack of wolves. In other words, that you're all singing from the one hymn sheet. That the familiarisation or getting to know each other the evening before is a very important aspect. It's not all about eating the meal, it's about getting to know people. For the chairperson and the secretary of the panel, it's important to know who can lead with questions. It's important to know where the expertise lies on different aspects. Tomorrow, there's going to be a session which we look at how we pull together panels. But panels are always pulled together. They're balanced. They're balanced in terms of gender. They're balanced in terms of academics, non-academics, industry experts. So the evening before is very important in terms of understanding where the balance on a panel lies, and it's important for everybody who's on that panel. What it is also important for, it's important that each panel member has the opportunity to discuss their own views in advance of meeting with the institution. And that evening before is always very informative because everybody comes with a different perspective and people bring ideas that somebody else hasn't thought about. And what in fact has happened, or my experience has been, that after the dinner and before people meet the next day, people usually go back to their rooms and they actually do more work. Now, I'm not asking you or telling you that's a requirement. That actually happens. We've never required it, but we do know it happens. Because by the time the panel meet the next morning, people may have changed their views, they may have found other things, they may have refocused on an issue that they had brought to the attention of the table the evening before. So briefing of the panel by HETAC can happen the evening before, or it can happen on the morning when you get into the institution or the provider. Invariably, it happens twice. It happens the evening before and it happens on the morning. We call it briefing of the panel. The briefing bit is just where the HETAC representatives bring to your attention maybe various core policies that have to be, the whole panel has to be mindful of in the context of the process there. But in fact, it's really an interactive session where the panel members discuss and agree and broad parameters that they're going to work in. What is very important, and we would always say this, a decision is never made at any of these briefing sessions or the evening before. Good documentation mightn't materialise. It might mean you could go into a provider and find that there was nothing, no substance behind that. Maybe a consultant pulled it together. There may be nobody who can carry it through. Poor documentation doesn't necessarily mean that when you go into the provider you're going to have problems. You might get a whole different story when you go in. So although the panel meets and discusses and broadly, I suppose, sort of says, well, if I had no other information, this is what I might conclude, we don't make any conclusions on the previous evening or on the morning when the panel meet. So the deliberation by the panel members, again, it's a review of what would have happened the evening before, and it's also about assigning tasks for the day. Who's going to lead on questions on QA? Who can lead on questions on programme design? In the context of institutional review, who can lead on governance? So the deliberation by the panel is really includes assigning tasks. The meeting with the provider, I've kept that very general. The first meeting, though, in any evaluation is with the senior management or the senior team, the president, if it's a professional body, it could be the chief executive of the professional body. And in general, we would ask in that session that it's senior people who can discuss issues that they may not wish to discuss with other staff members. So it is confined generally to strategic issues, to issues around governance, to issues around funding. And in general, staff delivering on programmes don't attend that session. The same would apply with the professional body evaluation. For the first session, I'm calling the first session, it's meeting with senior management who can answer questions around strategic vision, around governance, around funding. About 10 years ago, there was a tendency for long PowerPoint presentations to happen at that point, where in effect all of the documentation you received was just put up on PowerPoints, and you listened and you listened and you listened, and everybody got frustrated. The process now requires that the presentation at this point by the institute, the provider, is kept to a minimum. And this enables the meat of the thing to get going. The panel can ask lots of questions at this time, but the first session is purely around strategic issues and around governance issues. I think we recognise a few people in the room here at the moment on these slides. 10:35 a.m. tea break, and whoever put these slides together noted that there was no chocolate. Being a chocoholic, they probably figured that I wouldn't have been too happy with that tea break. Following the tea break, and this is the interesting thing, meeting with academic staff. In the case of the professional body, it's the tutors, it's the examiners. In the case of a review to review a programme, it will be the academic staff, the examiners, and so on. What generally happens at this session is that you actually ask the same questions that you asked in the first session, but there's a totally different focus. And the idea being just that you can have something on paper, you can have answers to questions you have, but if you ask the questions a second time or a third time from different groups, you may get totally different answers. So often it's just about checking the veracity of what's in the documentation, checking consistency between two different groups within a college. And even when it would come to meeting people like the librarian and so on, are they telling you the same story that you had heard in the first sessions around funding being available and about ease of access to library, etc., etc., etc. So the meeting with academic staff is really about teasing out how they operate on the ground, how do they deal with learners, what are the issues with assessment, what are the issues around retention, and do they confirm what's stated in the documentation.